So once again, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for logging into our MSDN webcast entitled Web Parts and Workflows in SharePoint Server 2007 and Visual Studio. As a reminder, this is part 10 of the 12-part series. Very pleased to introduce to you Lynn Langett. She is an MSDN developer evangelist with the Microsoft Corporation. Lynn, thanks so much for being with us. You now have the floor.
Great, thanks a lot. Well, welcome to everybody listening in. Looks like I have a nice, good crowd this week, and I see a lot of familiar names from our series. If you're back, thanks for coming back. If you're new to the series, this is, as was being told, part 10 of a 12-part series on SharePoint for developers. If you wish to download the previously recorded series iterations, you can go to either Mike's blog or my blog. For the majority of the series, both Mike and I, Mike is one of my colleagues based out of the Upper Midwest, were either presenting or helping to answer your questions during the presentations. This week, however, Mike is in Orlando enjoying Tech Ed, learning lots of new stuff, so gave him the week off, and it's just me. Looks like I have a pretty big crowd, so bear with me on the questions. I'm going to try to get through the presentation, do demonstrations, and answer your questions in line as much as is possible. One thing that I want to mention before we get started is I'm going to be concluding this series in 2 more webcasts, and I will then be launching a new webcast series that will be hosted via live meeting and also via the developer portal Channel 9. If you're not familiar, http://channel9.msdn.com. The name of the series is Geek Speak, and I will be co-hosting with another counterpart, Glenn Gordon, who's based out of Atlanta from MSDN team. And the series is developer-to-developer talk and demos with very little PowerPoint, and again, a focus on answering your questions. So it's a similar type of format with more developer technologies. And we've got July and August lineup on the books, and I'll be posting that very shortly to my blog, which you can see the address here, blogs.msdn.com/SoCalDevGal. So I encourage you to take a look at Geek Speak. It's going to be kind of fun, and we're going to do some innovative things around participation as well. In addition, I want to point out that post-event, Mike and I will always be posting links and information about the topic that we are discussing in the webcast on our blogs. And I've actually done quite a bit of work for this one because this is a pretty big topic area, and I have lots and lots of links I'll be posting after this event. So if I mention a URL during the event, you don't have to bother to try to scramble it down. So with that, let's kind of dig in and see what we're going to take a look at. We are expecting that you will have a general familiarity with the SharePoint server itself, and that you've maybe had some introduction to web parts. What I've found in working with developers that's not common, so I'm actually going to have a little bit of backgrounding before we start looking at developing web parts. Not too much, but just a little bit. In terms of workflow, it's kind of how much time we have to get into workflow is going to depend on how many questions are asked. So the point that I want to convey in today's webcast is sort of the methodology and thought process that you want to take as a developer when you're thinking about creating web parts or workflows, because basically there's a methodology that's similar across creating both of these object types. So in terms of an agenda, we are going to look at web parts and understand what they are, and I'll be, as usual, primarily demonstrating. As those of you who have been on this series before will know, I'm not a big fan of PowerPoint. I tend to use very few PowerPoints and very many demos, and work off of your questions and demos primarily. So shortly we'll be launching into my portal and looking at web parts, and we'll be talking about what they are and why you might want to consider including web parts in not only your SharePoint solutions, but in standard ASP.NET web solutions, because you can now. We'll then look at briefly SharePoint Designer, just briefly. I think it's important for you to understand what can be done there, and then spend the majority of our time looking at Visual Studio, talking about web part development. We'll touch on deploying web parts, and then as time allows, we'll get into creating and deploying workflows in Visual Studio. As I was working through this presentation, I realized that I probably could have done an entire hour on web parts and an entire hour on workflows, and I may end up and come back and stick a final iteration of this series on if we don't get through workflows very thoroughly today after part 12, if you will, just on workflows. I see we've got some questions popping up in the queue here, so I'm going to take a look and see what's going on with the questions. Somebody says they miss Mike. Well, yes, I miss Mike too, but we've all got to continue learning, even us, so that we can use all our technologies to the best effect. And then I have a question. Please share the URLs of the previous presentations of this series. Those are on our blogs. So for my blog, that's blogs.msdn.com/SoCalDevGal. And if you just search on the tag SharePoint, Mike's blog is benkotips.com. I think he has an entry, like 3 entries previously, that has all the links to the whole series. Also, just as an informational point, there is going to be a new web page in the MSDN calendar, webcast calendar, that allows you to search by presenter. We've actually got that in beta right now, and that should be coming out within the next month or so, because we just want to make sure that they put it with just a single presenter, and we want to make sure that you can search by multiple presenters, because we have a lot of us doing webcasts as sort of a tag team. So pretty soon you'll be able to go to a single page and search by presenter and see all webcasts, and that has come directly out of your comments on surveys. So we do read them. Make sure that you keep them coming. All right, to the task at hand here. What is a web part? If you're not familiar with SharePoint or not familiar with web parts, I'm assuming the majority of you are familiar with ASP.NET, or you wouldn't really be on the series. What you can think of a web part is as similar to custom content control or viewer for an ASP.NET page. So in other words, a type of ASCX control. It is a widget or a content container that can be placed on either SharePoint pages or now, new in this version, on regular ASP.NET 2.0 pages that will display some type of content. And this container can be reused across multiple pages and sites in a particular portal. It is set by default to display XML and format it via XSLT, but most of that is hidden from you in the design interfaces. Of course, we are developers, so we need to know what goes on under the hood, and that's sort of like the underlying guts of it. It's XML and XSLT. So that's what it is. Why should we care as developers? Why do we need to think about using web parts? Well, if you're going to be working with SharePoint, they are the primary basis for placing content on SharePoint pages. So the portal that you start with will contain a number of web parts which you need to look at and see if they can be used in the state that they're presented, or if you need to be creating new web parts because there is no basis for what you're needing in terms of your business requirements, or more typically, if you can, as the second bullet point says, inherit from the web parts that are there and use them as base types or base controls. Web parts, of course, the data is strongly typed because it's XML. They are securable to a very fine level of granularity. They are securable to the level of the user, as in which users can add web parts to SharePoint pages, which users can customize which properties, and they also contain the ability to associate what's called Code Access Security, or CAS, which is security that's applied not to a machine or a location or a user, rather to a set of code. So it's an additional layer of security, because web parts will often interact with systems that are outside the boundaries of the particular web application or SharePoint server. For example, retrieve data from a database or a web service or something. So security is obviously of utmost importance. And an interesting aspect to web parts is they have this built-in interface as part of the base class that allows end users, authorized end users, to perform some levels of customization, which can push some of the UI design off of your plate and onto either a very sophisticated end user group or onto administrators or content managers. So you can do the work that you prefer, which is write the business logic code, and let people who are actually going to be working with the interfaces do the UI stuff. So lots of cool things. Just like almost every other object in the world of SharePoint, it's important before you crack open Visual Studio and you start writing code for web parts that you understand as developers what can be done from within the SharePoint interface. And I'm going to be demonstrating this shortly, but basically what you're able to do is take the existing web parts and do a level of customization, a sort of simple level, and then you can save that customization and reuse that as a new web part. So as is with many other aspects of SharePoint development, a very important thing for you to do as a developer, you need to crack open SharePoint and take a look at what you can do from within the interface before you start writing code. There are galleries inside of SharePoint, and those list the web parts that are available, and we'll be taking a look at that in a minute. So when you're designing, you need to be aware of how and in what categories and to which users your web part should be made available, and make sure that information is conveyed to your SharePoint administrator. And you can also create pages or sites from templates. That's actually going to be the topic of next week, the templates. But the reason we're talking about it in terms of web parts is templates can include web parts. So it's another type of design task or development task in the world of SharePoint, rather than what we had done as ASP.NET developers in the past, which is just create entire pages and perhaps use ASTX files, or maybe a more broader metaphor that we all can understand is use includes in ASP. What we now do in the SharePoint world is we use customized web parts and possibly templates with customized web parts. So I've been doing too much talking. I know I'm going to get to a demo here. So let me go over to my desktop and see what I've got going. So there's my put on blog, so you can see that. Okay, hopefully everybody can see this okay. What this is a virtual machine. And I know I say this every webcast, so I apologize for those for whom this is redundant, but it is important to understand that for SharePoint developers, you must install SharePoint on a server product. So you cannot install it on just Vista or XP or such like that. You must get some virtualization technology, assuming you don't have a server on your desktop. So get our virtual PC, it's free, and then get Windows Server 2003 or Longhorn when it comes out. And then you can set up your your SharePoint development environment. So I'm going to pop open the default portal here. If you don't have the resources or the time to set this up, sort of a quick and dirty way that you can experience SharePoint is through the MSDN Virtual Labs. You can just search on that, and you'll get a completely configured environment that you can do really whatever you want to as an admin. The catch is you only get it for 90 minutes. After 90 minutes, it resets. So it's a great way if you just want to start exploring. So I'm going to quickly go over to a site here and just kind of look at web parts. So each of these areas of content is a web part. And if I wanted to edit the page, again, SharePoint 2007 is security trimmed. So I'm not really focusing on appropriate security here. I'm running everything as administrator just so that we can see all possibilities. So what I mean by this is if a person accessing this page wasn't permitted to add or remove web parts for this particular area of the portal, they wouldn't even see this edit page menu. And what we have on this page is we have web part zones. Each of the blue squares is a web part zone. And then if we click Add a Web Part, we will be shown the web part gallery. Again, I know for some of you this is familiar, but it is important when we're going to talk about creating these things that we understand what it is we're going to create. So while this guy's coming up here, and in addition to adding web parts, what we also can do is we can customize web parts. So let's add something really simple here, like a link list. And web parts sort of generally consist of lists, so specialized types of lists, links, to-dos, contacts, so on and so forth. You can think of it like an Excel spreadsheet in a way. And they also consist of connections to line of business data. Now this is only available in the full portal. It's not available in WSF, the free version, which is just the collaborative templates. The collaborative templates have the simple list web parts, but some of the more sophisticated ones, like showing line of business data, aren't available here. Anyway, for the purposes of our discussion, we're just going to add a linked list web part, and then we're going to edit it. And as a developer, you'll be creating these web parts, and one of the important aspects of creating the web part is deciding which of the aspects or the properties of the web part you wish to make configurable in the SharePoint interface. Now, this isn't limited to SharePoint. An interesting thing is web parts are now available in ASP.NET 2.0 pages because it's compatible. So you can actually bring this kind of structure to a non-SharePoint website. So in this world, we've got the ability to see the list with different views, so different types of metadata. We have different toolbars. We can change the appearance. And I want to show you particularly advanced. We can have things like how the help comes up. And again, this is not obviously in this particular instance designed for end users. I don't think very many end users understand the difference between modal and modalless, not those that I've met anyway. So the level of sophistication of this interaction is something very important for you as developers to think about when you're writing your web parts. Interestingly, of course, SharePoint ties into Active Directory, so your target audiences are SharePoint groups that are subsets of Active Directory groups. So again, lots of interesting integration points. So I can use the current web parts, or I can create new inside of here. So if I go to create, I am in fact creating a reusable object. So if I create a, let's say, custom list, well, probably the most typical one that will be done is import a spreadsheet. So you have a list of something in some format, and you'll import, and I didn't bother to make one, and you'll import a spreadsheet, and that will turn into a web part. So let me just do this through the interface, just real quick like. And I'll just call it test, and display in the quick launch, yes. Hopefully I don't have something called test in here already. Names names of objects have to be unique in SharePoint because all objects, metadata is being stored in the SQL Server database. So that's actually a common question I've received post-webcast. So I thought I'd just mention it here. And once I would create this list, which would simply consist of columns and data types, and save it, then this object, so here I basically just have a title, and then if I wanted to change it, I could just change the list settings, change the view. And again, I'm thinking that a lot of you are probably familiar with this, but just to make sure, create a column. And then I'm creating a web part per se, and I say, let's make this a date and time column. And I could do a description. And you're basically, it's a UI to prevent people from having to write any code. Okay. And now I've added it. And now this thing is going to be an object type. So I could reuse this in a new document library. I could put this on a page, so on and so forth. And just to show you that, if I go back and I say Site Actions, Edit Page, and I add a web part, there's my test right there. So it is a web part. So the simplest possible way is right within the portal. Now obviously we're developers, so we want to go a little bit further than that. Let me pop back out and see if there's any questions. Looks like, yeah, got some questions here. I got a question here. When using the web parts in ASP.NET, are they the same thing as a content placeholder? No, they're actually not. And when we get into the development talk, you'll see the differences. From John here, if web parts are available in ASP.NET 2.0, can I take a SharePoint web part and use it on a normal ASP.NET page? And the answer is it depends on how you create it. There are two ways programmatically to create web parts. And if you create it in the new way, then yes, you can. If you create it in the old sort of way that down levels to WSS 2.0 or SharePoint 2003, then you cannot. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So let me clear this guy out here. And and I'll go back to demonstration. Okay, so we're all understanding web parts inside of the SharePoint product itself. Oh, and one other thing that I want to mention is another thing that you want to do, and this goes for both workflows and web parts, is before you start writing your own, investigate which web parts are available as a default, as a part of your portal. So in other words, everything listed here, and be sure to go to the Advanced Web Part Gallery, because you're going to be pleasantly surprised at how many are there. And then do some looking on the internet to see which web parts are commercially available. There are several very good web parts that are actually available for free, and then there are a lot of partners and vendors that have set up web parts for, that integrate very nicely to CRM products and things like that. In fact, before I joined Microsoft, one of the things that I would tell my clients as an architect when they were looking at purchasing proprietary products and solutions is to actually ask the vendors whether they were going to include web parts as part of their offering, because of the ability to put them on ASP.NET pages. It really makes it a lot more flexible for developers. So look at what's there before you start writing your own web parts. Now, once you've sort of exhausted all those possibilities, and just one other thing I want to say before I jump off of that is we have fabulous web parts available for our own products. So particularly anything in the Exchange Outlook realm. So anything that you see in Exchange Outlook, anything, calendars, to-dos, tasks, anything you like in Outlook we have free web parts that integrate with SharePoint. Also, if any of you are using our CRM products, very, very strong. So I'm going to just get out of here. And then I'm going to open up the SharePoint Designer. We'll take just a brief tour inside of there. If you're not familiar with this product, this is the sort of lightweight design / some development tool for SharePoint. This is new with Office 2007. We no longer have front page. It looks a lot like front page, but it is not front page. If you were doing non-SharePoint visual development, then our product is Expressions Web. So we have Expressions Web for that, and then this product is designed to support customized design and development with SharePoint. So we've got, I think actually the admin site opened up here, but if I open this guy up and I say new, notice I can have ASPX pages because we're 100% ASPX 2.0 compliant. SharePoint content, then this is really designed more for designers than developers. So you're not going to see a lot of dev terminology. So lists are actually web parts, but because it's sort of friendlier to see them as list, that's the way that you see them. Document libraries are actually web parts. Surveys are web parts. So when I was talking earlier about inheriting from what's there and creating an enhanced version, this is sort of the first stop that you should make as a developer. Again, it's not that I don't like to work in Visual Studio. I like to exhaust all my other possibilities first because, frankly, they're quicker usually. So if I wanted to create some sort of custom iteration of a survey, or let's take a list here. Let's take the link list. Let's call it links lin. Then I could do that inside of here. To sort of the next level up. So I've got my links lin, and notice that this object consists of multiple ASPX pages. So if I wanted to do something different in, for example, the all items ASPX page, just open that up. And then we've got our toolbox once this opens over here. And you can see right now it's grayed out because it's not quite open, but let me take the style sheet out so you can see it better. We've got HTML controls, ASP.NET controls, SharePoint controls, server controls. So the idea is Visual Studio-like design. So it's got this SharePoint Designer has a little bit more meat to it than maybe the name would indicate. If I were naming it, I would call it SharePoint Designer and Developer. But it's probably why I'm not in marketing, because I'm not good at naming things. So I can boost my virtual PC here. Once this all items comes open, then I'll just show you a couple things quick like in here. Notice we've got master pages loading. Probably familiar with that concept from just good old ASP.NET. So now we have, if we go into the, I need more real estate here. If we go into, you can see it. I mean, I'll just show you. There's the, actually just go over to the design view. It's a little easier to see. So this is a links page here. And now our controls become available. So we have, you know, the obvious good old HTML controls, nothing exciting there. HTML form controls. We have the ASP.NET controls that we're all familiar with, right? Add rotator, so on and so forth. We have web part controls. Now, interestingly, this is a sort of a smart IDE, or an integrated development environment. If you look at this, it says controls in this category may not be used in a website based on Windows SharePoint services. Instead, insert web parts from the web parts task pane. Oh, interesting. So what are we doing here? We click this, and look what we get. We get that same, it's called a gallery, that we got inside of the portal. And we can actually drag a web part on in the design environment. So, and why? What's the difference? We have even more control in the design environment because we have access to the underlying HTML. So it's the next level up. So anyway, so we go back to the toolbox. And let's look at the SharePoint controls. So the SharePoint controls have a different alias to them, and I'm just going to do some sort of nonsense things here. Let's see if I even can put any. I don't know that I can even put anything on because I don't have the right background. Basically, what they'll look like is they'll have a different prefix because they're SharePoint controls. Maybe if I can just find one here. Oh, here we go. Web part pages. See it? List view part. So they have basically a different alias because they're inheriting from a different base class library. Okay? So again, certain of these are going to be restricted because we need certain types of SharePoint pages. This presentation isn't on SharePoint Designer per se. I just wanted you as developers to get a little peek into what it looks like. Okay, I'm going to pop back here. And yep, questions are piling up. So let's take a look here. That's usually when they start. I see a good question here from Fred. How is WSS planning to support the new AJAX extensions 1.0 into service packs, and when is this coming? Well, we've already got a CTP, or a beta in some ways, a community technology preview version of this out and available on the ASP.NET website. It's called AJAX Futures. And I've actually played around with it. It's pretty cool. You can download it, and it allows AJAX-like functionality into SharePoint web environments, web part environments. If you're not familiar, AJAX is asynchronous JavaScript, and what this allows to happen is partial page rendering. So probably the easiest way to understand it is if you think about one of the big mapping applications like maps.live.com or one of the competitors, because we all use these internet mapping applications now. So you drag and drop the map around and little parts of it render so that it comes back more quickly. The full page doesn't render, just the parts that you drag. That's kind of the design metaphor behind AJAX, that only parts of a page, there's more to it than that, but just real simply render so that you have a better experience for the end user, basically. From Kemi, I have, how can I configure the CRM web parts in SharePoint 2007? If you can be more specific, how can I enable them? How can I set security? Perhaps you might want to email me on that one. My email is lynnl@microsoft.com. So if you can be more specific on that one, I'll try to get you in contact with somebody who's going to be a better help. Next question. When we create a web part, is it only available on the top level site or all subsites? Are there any other settings to make these web parts available to subsites? Oh, that's a great question. It's dependent on what the web part is doing and what the security setting is in web config. We'll talk a little bit more detail in deployment later in the webcast here, but you can make it available, I guess is going to be the short answer right now. SharePoint Designer has the toolbox on the right side and the folder list on the left side by default, the opposite of VS. Yes, I know. Good comment, good comment. Can we modify SharePoint web parts in Visual Studio outside SharePoint Designer? Yes, we're going there next, actually. Can we design SharePoint through Visual Studio? Yes, I know you're all developers and you want to see Visual Studio, so we're going to go there next. So let's jump out of the question queue. Keep them coming. I think it makes a better webcast. And let's just take a peek at the slide here to see if there's anything I'm missing on the slides. Okay, so we looked at web parts, and we talked about how to get web parts. Like I said, exhaust all other possibilities before you move to the Visual Studio world so that you can be a productive developer. So download, customize from within SharePoint, create using SharePoint itself, or create or customize using SharePoint Designer. And then you move to Visual Studio. So how do you do this? Well, this is not really the tricky part, but it's kind of interesting actually. It can be confusing because what we've done in allowing development of web parts in Visual Studio is we've accounted for the fact that we have a relatively large installed user base of the old version of SharePoint. And the old version of SharePoint, in the 2003 version, or WSS 2.0 if you will, has a different object model than the new version. It is not 100% ASP.NET compliant. So we have actually two ways to make web parts inside of Visual Studio, and the method that you select is dependent on whether or not you have to be concerned with downward compatibility. There are a couple of pieces of functionality also that are only available using the more traditional way, and I've actually documented this, or I will on my blog. But sort of generally, you're going to, if you're not concerned with down-level compatibility, you've only got 2007, you're going to use the new way. If you are concerned with backward compatibility, you're going to use the old way. And that being said, I'm now going to switch over to Visual Studio and show you how to do it. So let's jump out of here. And let's open up Visual Studio. Now you have to install quite a few parts and pieces. Notice I've got the extensions for SharePoint services. Okay. And just to speak to what I was going to talk about later in the webcast, if I get to it, if you're going to be designing workflows for SharePoint, you have to also install the extensions for workflow. There is another piece that you might be interested in as well. This is part of the ECM, or the Enterprise Content Management download, or the SharePoint SDK, or Software Development Kit. And I have all these links on my site. I actually documented setting up a SharePoint development environment. Notice this thing is called the SharePoint Solution Generator. And it allows you through this GUI to create site definitions or list definitions, which we just discussed are in fact web parts. So yet another way that you can do this. All right. So we're inside of our familiar Visual Studio environment, and we've installed all the parts and pieces that we've talked about. So what do we then see? If we go to make a new project, we wait a second for the project list to come up. And we see inside of the project list, because we've installed the SharePoint extensions, we have a bunch of different types of SharePoint projects. So let's first look here. We have a team site definition, a list definition, which we just said is a type of a web part, an empty, a SharePoint sequential workflow, a state machine workflow library, a blank site definition, a web part, that looks promising, huh? A sequential workflow library, and a SharePoint server state machine. Now, if we were developing in the old way, then we would use this template, or alternatively, at this level, we could select it as well. It installs mysteriously at two different levels. So at the level of your language, and I'm using C# for the demonstration here, but you can use VB.NET or any other .NET compliant language as well. Okay, so we would select web part. So let's do that, and then we'll call it web part demo. Now, if you enjoy writing code, you will enjoy making a web part in this fashion, because you will be writing quite a bit of code. And as this renders, you'll see some of the files are going to load. The first thing to notice is the references that are added. You can see that we've got our typical references to system.web and XML and this plain old system, but we have a reference to the Microsoft SharePoint library. Excuse me for taking a sip of water, but I'm getting thirsty here. No mic to break up my talking, meaning Mike Benkovich. And you can see inside of our file here, we've got 3 namespace references, SharePoint, SharePoint Web Controls, and SharePoint Web Part Pages. In our template, you can see that our web part has been given a GUID, and we're inheriting from the web part class that's inside of the web parts namespace, inside of system.ui.webcontrols. And here's our constructor. And then we simply get our render method that takes our argument of an HTML text writer. Okay? Now inside of here, we then would have to manually write all of our code. So it is a pretty long process. You notice there's no visual help for us here. It's just manually writing all the code. Usually you're walking the DOM because you're working with some type of XML, which again lends to writing many, many lines of code. And this is the model that you would use to write web parts that are compatible with WSS 2.0. Now, to write the new kind of web part, you would create a project of type website and just pick any website. And I'm going to pick C# here. And I guess I can close the other solution. Whoops. I would like to close the other solution, but my virtual PC doesn't want to cooperate here. There we go. Has to do a lot of thinking about that. That was apparently a difficult request. So I'm going to reopen this guy and create a website and show you this sort of a new way to create web parts that are not only SharePoint 2007 compatible, but also ASP.NET compatible, which was a very common question. So I'm going to create a new website and say OK. And here I am on the good old default page that we're all familiar with. And we have some additional controls in our toolbox once we move over to the design view. Of course, we could stay in code view if we wanted to, but because that's a feature of Visual Studio 2005. But you can see in addition to our standard controls, we have a section here called Web Parts. And this is sort of the key to creating custom web parts in Visual Studio 2005. So the very first thing that we're going to need is a controller called a web part manager. Most commonly you're going to use the standard web part manager, and you're going to use Windows authentication. If you needed some other type of connectivity, you have the availability of using the proxy web part manager. And what this does is this controls all of the web parts that are going to render on the particular page. In order to place web parts on a page, you need a container, and that's called a web part zone. And of course, these are smart controls, just like the controls we're used to for our other UIs, whether they're web or Windows, and so they have these smart tags on them, which speeds up our development. It lets us kind of bypass some of the simpler things like formatting. And then inside of our zone, we can use any controls that we're interested in. So for example, if we wanted a drop-down list, we put a drop-down list inside of here, have our data source, and then if we wanted to have some data in here, of course we could put a data list or whatever we might want to. So the question you're probably asking yourself is, well, so what? Why would I want to take these standard controls and make them a part of the web part world? And the answer that I will give to you is because web parts are a more specialized type of reusable control. They're a smarter control, if you will. So we'll come back and demonstrate more in just a minute, but I want to check the question queue here. Oh yes, it's piling up now. And I am thinking that we are not going to get to workflow. So I'll promise you all, if you're came on for workflows. I'm sorry I'm not getting to it today, but I'm going to do a whole nother hour on workflows just because it's an interesting topic. Okay, so here's a kind of an off-topic question. What is the limit of items in a document library? You know, that's to stump the presenter. I know that there is one. I think it's 1 million documents. I'll find out for you, and I'll post it on my site. I think it's 1 million. You probably wouldn't want to put that many in there, but just from a usability standpoint. Next question. If you create a page in ASPX and you add a web part, if the user has access to the page but not the web part, what will happen? Will the page still render? Oh, what a good question. So if you create a page in a website with a web part and the user has access to that page and it has only that web part, then they're going to see a blank page. If it has other web parts that they do have access to, but they do not have access to this particular one, guess what? They won't see it. It's security trimmed. It's a beautiful thing. It was a highly requested feature from 2003 that we included in 2007. It's security trimmed. If a user does not have permission to see or do X, they will not see or do it. So that's that one. Another question. Can we integrate Lotus Domino with SharePoint 2007, make the email available through the My Inbox web part? I'm not familiar with the My Inbox web part. Is that something that comes with Lotus? I know it's possible to integrate other types of standard email. I don't know if Lotus has a web part already available or not. The other thing is, of course, web parts take as source data XML, so if they don't have a web part, then they certainly have a web service, and then you as a developer could write the web part to consume the XML that comes from the web service, I would think anyway. My email address again, Cami, just hit my blog, blogs.msdn.com/SoCalDevGal, and email me from that, okay? Let's see, next question. Where to get the web part template available in Visual Studio and the SharePoint Solution Generator? Again, I have a blog entry that if you search on it and search on SharePoint tag, it lists the URLs to all of the items that I've installed for this setup. And if I'm missing anything, again, hit me on my blog and I'll fix it, because I'm trying to save you guys time. It takes some time to find all this stuff, so I'm trying to put it all together on my blog so you can just click there, download, get going. Okay, Ted. To be sure, you said if we need to support a web part for 2003. Okay. So Ted is saying if we need down level support, if we've got SharePoint 2003, then as developers we need to choose the web parts template and not the ASP.NET template with the web parts, and that is exactly what I said. So good question. Thanks for asking that one. So choose the web parts template from the SharePoint item on the left. Next question, do we have to install any Visual Studio plugins for the new way of creating web parts? You would probably want to still install the SharePoint add-ons, because you get the list web part and you get the templates and some other things. So technically, no, if you only want the new way. But from a practical point, there's some other items like site templates and things that I'm not talking about today that you're probably going to want. So I would say yes. Okay, next question. How does the web part you create in VS 2005 get linked back to your SharePoint site? I'm going to try and get that covered when I talk about deployment, so I'll leave that one in there. If a web part doesn't render, is there a default image, or better yet, a different web part to render in its place? That is great thinking on your part, Mike. What I would recommend is that you put try catch finally, especially if you're doing the down level, because obviously things can go wrong. So you put a try catch finally, and if there is some sort of exception or unhandled exception, then you display, just like you display an error page on an ASP.NET website. So you display an error icon, or not icon, an error graphic, if you will. So very good. And Fred says, can we hide particular fields in a list based on the user? Yes, yes you can. The easiest way to do that, I think you don't even need any programming for that, if I remember correctly, although I could be wrong. Probably the easiest way to do that is to create what's called a content type. A content type is an XSD schema, and you can permission that and then make it available to the entire site and then make a list based off of that content type. Mike did a whole 1 hour on content types. So once you pull that one up, Fred, and then I think that would probably be the easiest way to do that one. So great questions. I love them. Okay, so let's go to the slides and see if we can make sure we're covering everything here. Okay, web parts. Okay, so deployment. Great. I thought that was coming up next. So you've created this web part. Now, one thing, and this is sort of a common metaphor across SharePoint development, if you create objects inside of SharePoint Designer, they are associated to the location where you created them, which is a significant limitation. So if you create a list at a location in a portal in SharePoint Designer, then yeah, you're creating a list web part. And that particular list will be available in that location. It will also be available to all users by default, if that was the default security when you set it up, through the web part browse gallery that I showed. Now, if you wanted to move that list, that custom list, to let's say a different portal or something, you actually couldn't do that easily. It's possible, but it's not really easy to do if you create it in SharePoint Designer. If you create objects, whether they're web parts or site templates or whatever in Visual Studio, then you're going to package them as what's called a feature. Okay? And I think I have that coming on the next slide. But this is sort of the steps to do that for a web part. So you create your web part, you copy it to the bin directory or the GAC, the Global Assembly Cache. Then I believe I mentioned this earlier, but you set the web config trust level, which is the code access security permissions. And those are the permissions for the particular instance of the code. So not for a user, not for a machine, for the code. And they have to do with the level of external access that the code running in this web part will have. So for example, can this web part read the registry? Can this web part go outside of the process of the particular ASP.NET page or not? And what we've done is we've sort of bundled these up into categories where we have the least restrictive, basically no restrictions, is called full trust, and then we have like minimal access, or I believe 4 categories. And again, I have a website URL reference on this, and it's just a line in web config that you set. Of course, obviously, we all know as developers, web config is case sensitive, so it's a common error to forget that when you're setting the trust level. Make sure to do that. Make sure to remind your admins. You can also do that, set that trust level if you don't want to manually edit web config using the administrative tool stsadm.exe, which stands for the old SharePoint Team Services, which is the old WSS. So stsadm.exe, and that's the administrative command line tool. You can do it that way. Then you add a web config entry for safe controls. Again, I'll have this documented on the webcast follow-up URLs, where you add the GUID of the control and you mark it as safe. You can kind of think of this as analogous sort of to marking an ActiveX control as safe to run in a browser. And then you add the .webpart file, which is an XML metadata file, like a manifest, so that your web part can be browsed in the gallery if you wish it to be. You know, to answer that earlier question, you may not want your web part to be browsable in the gallery, and then you test it on a page. So you package it up as a feature, and then basically you package it in either a cab file, or that's the most typical, it's some kind of compressed, zipped group of files. And then you can deploy it, although it's usually the SharePoint administrator who does this, but it might be you. You can deploy it using STSADM to any particular location that you want to deploy it. So that should kind of address that earlier question. So going to the more specific implementation details, to implement features, you add a subfolder with a feature definition within the features setup directory. It includes feature.xml. Again, I have a website article that has the more detailed steps. I just kind of did it one slide with an overview so you can understand. It defines the base properties of the feature and the list. Okay, and you can work with features in the SharePoint admin UI which if you're not familiar, there's a whole separate website that is a part of the MOS server, which is specifically for administration. I can pop out there and show it just really briefly. You can use STS administration, or if you're so inclined, you can actually write directly to the object model, which is web services. So I think I'm going to take a look at the questions, and I'm actually going to show the features in the admin website. Okay. So question. How can we handle web part resources in MOS? Images, XML, etc. files needed in logic in the web part. So if I understand Fred correctly, he's saying I need to associate, images, some sort of resource files with my web part. How do I package that on up? That's addressed and shown by example in the article that I will post on my blog after this webcast. There's an example of how to set up a package a web part as a feature. The short answer would be Fred will have to design this in Visual Studio. This is not something that you could do inside of SharePoint Designer because you can't package them as features there. Another question, is there a Visual Studio 2005 template to create features? Not that I know of. It's interesting though, because as I'm doing a lot of work internally with SharePoint, I'm subscribing to a lot of internal distribution lists, and the product adoption rate has just gone through the roof. And literally from just Microsoft employees worldwide, I get approximately 100 emails every 8 hours. No, I don't read them all. I'm not that crazy. But with questions on SharePoint and SharePoint deployment. And you might think, oh, that's just really crazy. But it's actually, I think, exciting because it just shows the worldwide adoption rate and the fact that we're all collaborating to give you an easier implementation. So I'll actually do some digging on that distribution list for this question. Is there a template to create features? Because I try to archive them all and read them like when I'm stuck landing in an airport or something. It's sort of a good thing to do. And I would guess there probably is, but maybe I just don't know where it is. So I'll keep working on that one. Okay, so here we've got a poor guy waiting for the workflow, which is probably going to be in a couple weeks. Sorry. Workflow guy. Workflow session, when will that be? Yeah, I'll put it on my blog. I promise I'll do it, but I have some commitments and I want to make sure I'm honoring them. I would say within 2 to 3 weeks. Fair enough? And another question, how can I open a list web part in Visual Studio? Okay, let's take a look. Okay, and we are really running low on time here, so we talked about that. Okay, so let's pop back over here. And I was going to show you the admin website just real quick because you need to see that in terms of features. See, kind of an interesting dilemma with SharePoint is it places new types of demands on administrators. It certainly places new demands on you as developers, but also as administrators. And my counterpart over in the TechNet team, Matt Hester, has done a series of webcasts that are really great for SharePoint administrators. I actually am not just a pure developer. I worked in the administrator space and taught. I have an MCSE and all that good stuff. So I have a sensitivity to this, and also having been an architect and deploying. Part of understanding how to work with this customization of SharePoint is understanding the deployment, for example, of web parts. So this is, if you've not seen it before, this is the admin site, and you really have 3 different sort of sections here. You have operations, and yeah, I know it's not really your realm, but you need to kind of be familiar, because what I usually find, especially in smaller shops, is the devs and the admins need to kind of work together to understand how to implement, situations just like this, deploying web parts. So in terms of features, enable features on existing sites. This is, I believe, a different kind of features. Yeah, the enterprise features, sorry. So we have to be more precise in our terms here. And I'm popping over. Okay, so it's not at the global level. It's at what's called the shared services level, and shared services is just simply a collection of settings. And actually, it's going to be within the portal. So if I go to the portal itself and I go to the site settings, isn't it fun to watch me struggle with this? think it's always fun to watch a presenter. Here we go. Site features. So by default, here are the features, which it's a little bit confusing terminology. It's not just web parts. It's also things like workflows that are available, and then you can activate them or deactivate them. And this is on the particular site administration, so I actually misspoke. It's not on the portal administration. So, okay, let me pop back out. We are running so low on time, so I've just got a couple more things I'm going to cover, and you guys are making me work for my money with questions today. So that's good. I like that. So we're going to do workflows in a subsequent, so I'm going to skip over that. And points to take away. Web parts are providers of customized UI, both within SharePoint and now also usable on an ASP.NET web page. You have really a menu of ways to create web parts, from the most simple, which is within SharePoint itself, to the most complex, which is writing all the code manually using the render method, which I meant to show you, but it has like 7 different overrides as well in Visual Studio. And you want to explore all the options and use the most appropriate method given your business needs. So let me mention again the blogs, because lots and lots of resources. I will actually immediately post resources about web part development. I have them all ready to go after this webcast. And just want to let you know, if you are interested in our regular live events where we go out and usually to movie theaters, starting in July, we're going to be talking about Silverlight and WCF and Link, actually. If you have suggestions that you'd like to see us talk about, either on webcasts or in live presentations, I welcome them, so please send them to me. I want to talk about what you're interested in. And I think with that, I am out of time, so I'm going to turn it back over to my producer.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Great presentation today. Ladies and gentlemen, just going to talk about a couple of things before we close down the webcast today. First of all, I am going to put the evaluation up, and I talked about it at the beginning, but I just want to remind you, fill out and submit that evaluation, and you are automatically signed up for the possibility to win a Microsoft Zune digital media player. So possible great benefit for you there. And certainly we really appreciate when you can take a moment, because the benefit for us is great when we can find out what you thought of our webcast. So thank you in advance for that. For upcoming and previously live webcasts, please visit www.microsoft.com webcasts. You will be able to find our entire catalog of webcast content, both on demand and live at that location, including this webcast should be available for replay within probably about 24 hours at that location. And Lynn, I think you have the replays posted on your blog as well?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so there's another place you can go to get them. If you have webcast content ideas, if there's something you would like to see that we have not already produced, let us know. We'd be interested to know what you would like to see. And we have actually produced a number of webcasts based on recommendations from our audience and attendees already. So don't feel shy about that. It's kind of a long URL there. You can go to the File menu and select Print the PDF to get a local copy of the slide deck right now. It'll give it in a PDF format, and I'll give you a reference back to these URLs. Last thing, today's webcast was presented using Microsoft Office Live Meeting. This is a great collaboration tool. If you're not currently using it in your business, it's definitely worth giving it a try. And Microsoft does offer a 14-day free trial of the software, and you can access that at www.microsoft.com/presentlive. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and push out that evaluation that I have been promising, and this is actually an evaluation launch page. It's a live web page that's opening in your live meeting interface at this time. There are 2 links there. One says registered online, the other one says all other registrants. The registered online link will open the evaluation with about the first half pre-populated with information you gave us when you registered for this webcast. If you prefer to start with a completely blank evaluation, you would hit the all other registrants link. And again, those are the 2 blue links just about in the middle of the page. And don't feel shy, you can now click on your live meeting interface. I'm going to stay on for a while. I want to ensure that everybody who tries to submit an evaluation is able to do so. So if you have any problems with that, please turn your seat color to red, and I will come on to a private chat and see if I can help you. With that, I wanted to give Lynn a special thank you. Thank you so much, Lynn. Great presentation today.
Sure, you're welcome.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for logging in. We really appreciate seeing you online, and we do look forward to seeing you all online for the remaining, it's 2 parts of this webcast, right, Lynn?
I think I'm committed to doing a 3rd one as well.
Uh-oh. Okay, well, great. Thank you, everybody. This will conclude the audio portion of this webcast. I hope everybody has a great day.